Assalamualaikum, good morning, and hi everyone. So thank you to all our wonderful speakers today for agreeing to speak at IDEA's webinar entitled The Myanmar Coup and the Role of ASEAN. Thank you also to all our participants joining in through the Zoom link and also Facebook Live. We hope you will enjoy the session today, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave comments at the Q&A box and we will bring your questions to the floor. I am Salsabila Abdulmanan from the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, IDEAS, and I will be your MC for today's session. We are all aware of the ongoing Myanmar crisis, the demonstrations and the protests that has been taking place across Myanmar since the military seized control on 1st February. Hundreds of people, including children, have been killed. So this Myanmar Today, this webinar today, will attempt to understand just how the Myanmar crisis threatens Myanmar's internal unity and regional centrality, and what role can ASEAN play in bringing all main stakeholders both inside and outside the country to the negotiating table. Before we move forward, I would like to lay down the tentative for today. We will have a session with each of our distinguished speakers. Mr. Eric Paulsen, the representative of Malaysia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission of Human Rights, AICHR. And then we will have Lilian Fan, the International Director and co-founder of Gitanoe Foundation. We will have Mo Suzar, Fellow of ISIS, Yusof Ishaq Institute, and also Khain Win, Director of Sandy Governance Institute. So this session will be moderated by Mr. Zokri Idris, who have the PhD in International Relations and Director of the External Relations from IDEAS. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite our moderator for today's session, Mr. Zokri Idris, to conduct the session. Please welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. MC, Ms. Salsabila Abdulmanan. My name is Zokri Idris, and I'll be the moderator for today's IDEAS online discussion entitled The Myanmar Coup and the Role of ASEAN. Once again, on behalf of the Institute of Democracy and Economic Affairs Malaysia, we would like to welcome each and every one of our attendees and our participants to our IDEAS online discussions today. And of course, our special thanks is attributed to our esteemed panelists who agreed to join our IDEAS online discussions today with all of their insights and perspectives to be offered to the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, the IDEAS online discussion today is part of our API program, which is the ASEAN Prosperity Initiative, which is a joint venture and a collaboration between IDEAS, as well as from the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, the ASEAN Trade Center, as well as from the Frederick Naumann Foundations. So this program that we're having today is part and parcel of the research and the advocacy program that IDEAS is currently taking to. And we definitely value all of our insights and perspective that we believe that is going to be very valuable to our programs later on in the future. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I do not intend to prolong this introductory speech. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Eric Paulsen. Mr. Paulsen is the representative of Malaysia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Mr. Eric Paulsen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, IDEAS Malaysia, for the invitation and also for the very kind introduction. On 24th April, ASEAN for the first time convened a special meeting to discuss a grievous issue concerning another member state, the coup in Myanmar. This was an extraordinary meeting as ASEAN, well known for its non-interference principle, has sought to address the crisis as its centrality, credibility, and relevance have been called into question. The ASEAN leaders meeting is a culmination of weeks of diplomatic efforts led mainly by Indonesia and Malaysia and Singapore, which had all advocated for a stronger response since the military coup on 1st February. Despite the odds of all 10 member states speaking in unison and firmly, the ASEAN leaders meeting reached a 5-point consensus on the following: an immediate cessation of violence, constructive dialogue among all parties concerned, for a special envoy of the ASEAN chair to facilitate mediation with the assistance of the Secretary General, 4 for ASEAN to provide humanitarian assistance, 5 for the special envoy and delegation to visit Myanmar. However, clearly missing from the 5-point consensus is the release of the State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi and other political prisoners, even though it was called for by several member states, including Malaysia. However, I would argue that this is still a better than expected outcome, as historically, we all know that it has been extremely difficult to engage with the previous military regimes of Myanmar. Although opponents of the coup and their supporters were not pleased with the outcome because they have argued that the release of Aung San Suu Kyi and other political prisoners should be the precondition to any dialogue, and that there should be a timeline set for the implementation of the 5-point consensus. That would be extremely tough, if not impossible, to negotiate. Unfortunately, there is no magic wand in diplomacy, where after a few meetings, a timeline could be set for a coup leader to step down and hand over party to the legitimate party. That just does not happen in real life, all the more so after so much blood has been spilled. While many were disappointed that ASEAN has engaged with the Tatmadaw instead of the shadow national unity government, this meeting is only the first step in opening the door to the mediation process, and eventually the NUG and all legitimate stakeholders would have to be consulted if there's to be a genuine and inclusive dialogue process. To realistically address the crisis, ASEAN has to speak to the de facto party in power, no matter how unpleasant it may be. There is just no way around this reality for any party seeking a realistic resolution. While there's a risk that by engaging with the Tatmadaw, ASEAN is legitimizing the regime, and certainly the optics are not great. It should be noted that no ASEAN leader referred to General Min Aung Hlaing as the representative of the Myanmar government, but as a leader of the Myanmar military. Whatever one might think of the viability of the 5-point consensus or the lack of any real and genuine leverage by ASEAN or any grouping of nations on the Tatmadaw, the fact remains that General Min Aung Hlaing met in person the ASEAN leaders and agreed here I put in inverted commas, to the 5-point consensus. This is a breakthrough and a major step in the right direction, as it provides an entry point and framework for constructive dialogue and hopefully peaceful resolution between all parties. The challenge now is how to hold the regime to the commitments he has made. But however, as we all know, the Tatmadaw has seemingly already backtracked from the 5-point consensus. A few days after the historic meeting on 27 April, the regime issued a press release stating that its administration will give careful consideration to constructive suggestions made by ASEAN leaders when the situation returns to stability in the country, and made clear that its priority was to maintain law and order. As for the NUG, since the leaders' meeting, it has said that it would not negotiate with the military regime. In an interview, Dr. Sasa, the Minister of International Cooperation and also spokesperson for the NUG, said that there will be no compromise unless 4 conditions are met. Return to the November 2020 election results, including the reinstallation of Aung San Suu Kyi as head of government, stopping violence against civilians, getting soldiers off the streets, and the release of political prisoners. Subsequently, both the Prime Minister and Vice President of the NUG said that while they appreciated ASEAN's efforts to end the crisis, but since it failed to engage with the NUG and did not see the full picture of the crisis, and only listen to the perpetrator, it would reject any dialogue until the preconditions are met. So now, more than 3 months on since the coup, there's an impasse between the de facto party that holds power. Illegitimate as it may be, the regime still possesses the bulk of the gun in the country. And they have shown that they're not reluctant to use them against unarmed civilians. On the other hand, you have the NUG with a legitimate claim to government and widespread support from the Myanmar people, and increasingly from ethnic armed groups, some of which have recently restarted hostilities with the Tatmadaw. As more protesters have realized the limits of peaceful protests, there are those who are opting to join the ethnic armed groups or the People's Defense Force that was recently announced by the NUG to fight the Tatmadaw. With no signs that any sides are backing down, Myanmar will be headed to more of the same. More violence and killings, bombings, arbitrary arrest and detention, torture and forced disappearances, forced displacement, etc., as the country continues to break down in the coming months, and probably an all-out civil war and humanitarian disaster in the making. The repercussions would be far-reaching, extending beyond Myanmar's borders, threatening regional peace, stability, security, and of course, ASEAN. While there's a lot of international attention and solidarity, there is a limit to what they can do to rein in the Tatmadaw. Statements of condemnation, diplomatic isolation, and sanctions imposed by the West without stronger UN Security Council measures have not had the desired effect on the military. The UN Security Council has met on a few occasions to discuss Myanmar, but remained deadlocked due to the threat of a veto from Russia and China. Unarmed protesters inside Myanmar facing live ammunition fire have been calling for the international community to do more, although it is unclear what else can be done other than stronger sanctions and further isolation against the regime. There have been calls for the UN to invoke the responsibility to protect, or R2P doctrine, that seeks to prevent mass atrocity crimes like in Rwanda and the Balkans in the 1990s. It calls on the international community to protect people when their states manifestly fail to do so, including by military intervention in extreme cases to prevent large-scale loss of life. However, military intervention is simply not an option, as no major power is likely to take up arms against the Tatmadaw. Moreover, it will never pass the UN Security Council, as Russia and China have blocked all attempts to authorize its further use since the controversial NATO airstrikes in Libya in 2011. I think it's worthwhile to note that in Syria, for example, despite more than 10 years of atrocities and war, the UN Security Council have not managed to agree on the use of military intervention. There's a huge gap between what the people of Myanmar need and what the international community can do. For now, the international community has accepted that ASEAN is best placed to take the lead, as it is rightly so. However, it is not realistic to expect the military regime, after a single face-to-face meeting with ASEAN leaders, or even multiple meetings, to immediately and fully observe the 5-point consensus. In order for the dialogue process to work, the international community and all stakeholders must work together with ASEAN. ASEAN does not work in isolation or in exclusion of others. The UN and other states are also working on different tracks to help resolve the crisis, but they also recognize that ASEAN is probably best placed to reach out to the Tatmadaw. In the coming weeks and months, China, Russia, the US, the EU, India, and Japan will all likely play a role in both supporting ASEAN and working with other like-minded states and the UN to help resolve the crisis. While ASEAN is far from the perfect means to resolve the impasse in Myanmar, but it is probably the most plausible option available. The ASEAN Special Envoy and the ASEAN Secretary General would now have the impossible task to facilitate an all-inclusive mediation process and bridge the gap between the Tatmadaw and all parties concerned, including the NUG and the ethnic armed groups. Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy, which she leads, have the strongest claim to a legitimate government after winning the elections twice in 2015 and November last year by a landslide against the military-backed political party. It is therefore crucial that all stakeholders continue to demand for her release, as well as other political prisoners, as without their involvement in the mediation process, it will struggle to find broad-based support from the Myanmar people. Despite the early mixed messages, ASEAN must move forward, as it has committed to the 5-point consensus. There is no turning back. There's also no magic wand to magically transform these 5 points or any demands into reality. The hard work begins now, as obviously nothing will be achieved if these 5 points are not translated into reality for the benefit of the Myanmar people. We will know in the coming months how seriously General Min Aung Hlaing values ASEAN and the purposes and principles enshrined in the ASEAN Charter, as preparations are made for the dialogue process and the Special Envoy's visit to Myanmar to meet with all the parties concerned. It is of course not all on ASEAN to address the situation in Myanmar. At the end of the day, the future of Myanmar must be determined by its own people. But ASEAN must do its part by promptly appointing its Special Envoy without further delay. Crucially, the Special Envoy must have a full but also flexible mandate, and his or her office must be properly staffed, funded, and supported so that constructive dialogue can begin as soon as possible. Once the Special Envoy has been appointed, the immediate priorities must be to convince the Tatmadaw to cease violence against unarmed civilians and to release Aung San Suu Kyi and other political prisoners so that dialogue can begin. None of this is ideal, but ASEAN must do what is practical at any point in time and keep moving in the right direction. It will be a long and hard road ahead. One only needs to look at the various crises around the world to know that wanting the right and principled outcome is easier said than done. While the parties, the mediators and stakeholders may know what they want to achieve: peace, stability, normality, safety, security, federalism, democracy, constitutional government, rule of law, human rights, etc. There are trust and confidence that must be built, compromises that must be negotiated, the realistic outcomes that must be considered. The exact route and how long this process takes can only be decided in time by all the parties and stakeholders involved in the dialogue process. So that is all I have for now. Just to set the scene and my take on the situation. I'll be very happy to take on the, any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Mr. Eric Paulsen. Mr. Paulsen has enlightened us on the chronological background on what's happening in Myanmar, and I think that's quite extensively described for us to understand what's happening in Myanmar. Ladies and gentlemen, for your information, Mr. Eric Paulsen is the representative of Malaysia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, the AICHR. He co-founded Lawyers for Liberty in 2011, a human rights organization in Malaysia, and was its advisor until becoming its executive director from 2014 to 2018. Thank you once again, Mr. Eric Paulsen. We'll be engaging with you soon. Now, let's move on to the second speaker. Our second speaker is Ms. Lilian Phan. I'm just going to read a bit of introduction of Ms. Lilian. Lilian Phan is an international director and co-founder of Getone Foundation, I hope that I'm pronouncing it rightly, a regional humanitarian organization based in Kuala Lumpur and Aceh, and the chair of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network Rohingya Working Group, the APRRN. She is also the head of the Secretariat for All Party Parliamentary Group Malaysia on Refugee Policy. She is a cultural anthropologist and humanitarian professional with more than 20 years of experience working with refugees, internally displaced persons, and communities affected by conflict and disaster, which includes Aceh, Myanmar, Haiti, and Syrian refugees in Jordan, and currently specializes on the situation of the stateless Rohingya in Rakhine State and in ASEAN. With that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Lilian Phan onto the virtual stage, please.
Thank you so much, Zukri, and thank you to Ideas for inviting me for this really timely and important discussion. I think what I would like to do today is really talk about some of the key elements in ASEAN's mandate according to the 5-point consensus which emerged from the leaders' meeting, but really to look at what's needed on the ASEAN side in order to be able to navigate. And I think what we need to look at are the gaps between the reality and the context in Myanmar, this an extremely complex context, and ASEAN's existing mechanisms, but also ASEAN's political will and creativity to be able to generate and design processes and mechanisms which perhaps don't exist for this very unprecedented situation. So I think, as Eric was saying, we can actually look at the 5-point consensus as covering several elements. I mean, I think it's obvious that there are member states within ASEAN who feel more strongly about certain issues and others who push issues that are not in the 5-point consensus. So I think that's one of the first things we need to recognize. The 5-point consensus are the issues and the commitments where there was really a kind of a common agreement amongst the 10 member states. But there are, I think it's quite clear from the past few months that there are certain member states, and I think we can just name them, it's Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore in particular, who have been much stronger in their condemnations of the violence, their concern for what's happening in Myanmar, and have and did try to push, actually, I think all 3 of these countries for one of the issues that I think ASEAN has been criticized on right now, which is the release of political prisoners. So I think that we need to recognize that ASEAN is not monolithic. I think there's a really strong perception right now in Myanmar that ASEAN just misses the point. But I think we need to see what happens behind the positions and behind the statements. And I think it's important to recognize that anything that comes out in a statement is a product of a lot of negotiation, over language, over the consensus building, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only thing that is on the table and the only things that will be addressed during any kind of ASEAN engagement. I think what we can see is that from the 5-point consensus, you can see that there are two main elements of ASEAN's mandate, if you like, to work on this Myanmar crisis, which are political dialogue and humanitarian assistance. And the condition for both of those to be able to happen is stopping the violence. It's an essential condition for both of these tracks, if you like, to proceed. I think on all these fronts, in terms of the political dialogue, in terms of the type of humanitarian engagement, and in terms of trying to stop the violence, ASEAN is really in uncharted territory. So I think that we need to recognize that even getting to the point where there was a leaders' meeting that was held, as Eric has said, was an enormous step for ASEAN, especially under these conditions, with the global pandemic, which has really affected all of our economies and societies in ASEAN as well, to put the Myanmar crisis at such a high level of priority, as slow as it may be and frustrating as it may be for those of us who work on human rights and humanitarian issues. I think we need to understand that ASEAN does take this very seriously, and that there is a sense and an understanding, at least to a level, of some of the implications, that this is not just an internal issue. It's not something which ASEAN can just leave. There are regional implications, but also that the implications which may not be so regional, which are really about the impact on Myanmar citizens and people residing in Myanmar, that enough, the kinds of human rights violations that are taking place, the types of violence are just unacceptable, and in fact are in violation of the ASEAN Charter. So I think there is, I wouldn't say a total shift, but I think there's a growing recognition in ASEAN that certain types of conduct do actually go against the values of the regional organization. I think what's important to understand, though, is that, ASEAN has made commitments to work on issues which it doesn't have a strong history on doing so, not as ASEAN. Although certain member states, for example, working on political dialogue, working on facilitating dialogue in very complex conflict situations, that has been done by certain ASEAN countries, not as ASEAN necessarily, but there has been experience by Malaysia, for example, in Mindanao, by Indonesia in its own, multiple forms of conflict internally, and in fact some successful peace processes in Indonesia, which I think are very worth learning from. But also in terms of the humanitarian side, which I will talk about more, as that's my area of expertise, I think what's important to understand is that this is not the type of humanitarian crisis that ASEAN is used to dealing with. And the mechanism that we have within ASEAN to deal with humanitarian crises, which has been growing so much stronger and has been becoming more institutionalized over the last 10 years or so, is the AHA Center, which is a center that has really been built to specialize on natural disasters and humanitarian assistance in the context of natural disasters. That's not to say that that's all they've done. There have been a few occasions where they've been asked by a member state of ASEAN to deliver aid into a conflict context, and that happened in the case of Marawi, most prominently when the government of the Philippines asked the AHA Center's assistance to facilitate the delivery of aid from other ASEAN countries to Marawi. But this is a very different type of context. I mean, what we're talking about here, and also the kind of ASEAN role that is being envisioned and is being discussed right now is also very different. It's not your usual business. So I think that we need to dive in a little bit into what is different about this crisis that makes it actually difficult and very important for ASEAN to take its time in, not to say take its time in responding, but to not to rush into designing a kind of an architecture for this, which may not be appropriate. And I think what's an important lesson from two crises, I would say, one where ASEAN responded and one which was a national response. I think if we look at the Nargis response and we look at the Indonesia's response to the Aceh tsunami, even though those were natural disasters, they were both highly politicized. One, the Aceh tsunami took place in the context of the conflict between Aceh and Jakarta, and the peace agreement came about only after the tsunami, facilitated and triggered actually in some ways by the tsunami itself. And secondly, Cyclone Nargis, where although it was a natural disaster, it was at a time where Myanmar was still closed, still under sanctions. It was still under the former iteration of the Tatmadaw. And that's when I worked. I had the pleasure of working under former ASEAN Secretary General, Dr. Surin Pitsuwan, under his special envoy in that office during the Nargis response. And I think one of the things that's really critical is that in both those crises responses, the design, I think that the ASEAN and Indonesia in both those respective crises understood that their existing institutions and their existing mechanisms were inadequate to deal with the context. And therefore they designed mechanisms that were appropriate to the context at that particular time. And they did so in a way that those processes were flexible because the dynamics of those crises were extremely fluid. And this is very much the same as the kind of crisis we see now, and even more so, I would say. There are so many elements, and actually all over the country. It's not, a crisis which is limited geographically to one particular point, as natural disasters usually are. So I think this is one of the key things that ASEAN should learn, and those of us who are trying to help ASEAN and advise ASEAN and the ASEAN stakeholders, on trying to respond to this, really need to emphasize, if we can't be rigid about this, and I think this is one of ASEAN's great challenges, trying to deliver in a way that isn't going to just create more bureaucracy. And deliver with speed. The AHA Center can do that well. They can deliver with speed, but they're not equipped to work on complex political contexts and in environments of conflict. So there are lots of elements that need to be addressed. I think we need to understand a couple of things. One is that, I think that both sides, and it's not just two sides, number one, there are so many actors involved. This is not just a conflict between, the Tatmadaw on the one hand and the NUG or the CRPH. This involves as well so many other stakeholders, particularly from the regions. And there have been long-standing ethnic conflicts that have not been resolved over all these years, even when Myanmar entered its transition period. There was a national ceasefire process that was underway, but it wasn't that successful. And in fact, it had almost stalled under the NLD government. So I think that, number one, we need to look at this as an extremely complex tapestry of many different stakeholders, and all of them will need to be involved in a dialogue, right? So when ASEAN is thinking about mediation or facilitation of some type of dialogue with relevant stakeholders, who are they thinking about? So I really think that ASEAN needs to listen. ASEAN really needs to listen to the experts from Myanmar who understand the ethnic conflicts and really understand the dynamics and can advise them on how dynamics are changing. So we need to have impartial, because you need to have the impartiality of being an observer rather than a participant, but they need to have that impartial understanding and advice on this very dynamic conflict, to think about who needs to be engaged in these discussions and what's on the table, right? What are the issues for discussion? I think we need to understand that Myanmar has been under civil conflict for a very long time. Parts of the country have been under protracted low intensity civil war for many years, actually since I think we can actually say almost since its independence. But that now there's increased violence. Obviously most of it is state violence, but that's triggering increased resistance, which has been largely peaceful, but can also, and I think we can start to see elements of that resistance teetering towards, not only being peaceful. I don't want to say necessarily armed, but certainly there have been incidents now of civilians organizing and trying to resist the violence that they're facing in slightly less than non-peaceful ways. So I think we need to watch this as well. There's a potential for a lot more violence to take place. And if solutions and if proper facilitation of this crisis is not forthcoming, there will be more reason for people to think that there's no other option than to take up arms of some kind or to ally themselves with groups who have arms. The third thing is that the humanitarian context in terms of humanitarian needs is very complex. So we're not talking about a situation where you've had a crisis and either the conflict is over or the disaster has happened and then you just go in and assess the needs. So I think one of the first things that ASEAN will need to do is to do the preliminary assessment on humanitarian needs, and that itself will be very complex. What are you assessing? Where are we assessing? This is not just about going in and looking at houses that have been burnt or water systems that need repair. This is very, very different because the crisis is ongoing. It's the political contestation that is generating a breakdown in the economy and a breakdown in the health system, which are in turn generating the humanitarian needs. So as long as you have this conflict taking place, the humanitarian needs will continue to grow as well as the economic breakdown. So I think we also need to really understand this from the perspective of political economy and make sure that we are equipping the ASEAN actors, the special envoy, and other actors who will be involved in this in continuous ongoing analysis that really tries to capture what the ongoing situation are and looking at where ASEAN could possibly intervene. So it's not going to be a regular humanitarian aid, distribution that's needed. I think we really need to think in a much more complex way here. The other thing I would say is, I think besides the 5-point consensus, I think we need to also look at where ASEAN member states, as well as ASEAN stakeholders, which include think tanks, can actually contribute to looking at the other elements which are not included in the 5-point consensus. So for example, transnational crime, and that's related to the economic breakdown and also to the political instability. I mean, I think we've heard a lot of analysis now from some of the experts on Myanmar that this was already a sort of thriving, a thriving sector, and it's just, this crisis is just going to fuel the transnational crime circles. And that's extremely dangerous. I mean, already there was a 40 billion industry in methamphetamines, right, from the Golden Triangle. And that's just set to grow. That's only one form of transnational crime. There are lots of others, as the human trafficking. If we look at the Rohingya crisis, for example, that's also going to be unresolved. That, of course, also involves human smuggling. I mean, there are just going to be numerous ways in which people who are vulnerable now to this crisis, whether it's direct political violence or it's the vulnerability that comes with a breakdown of society, people are going to try to find ways of fleeing. They will be exploited by human smugglers and traffickers. And existing conflicts like in Kachin and Rakhine State, not just the Rohingya but the Rakhine, are going to remain unresolved or will shift very dramatically. And the existing refugee crisis with 1 million plus Rohingya plus many others, hundreds of thousands of others from the ethnic minorities in Myanmar, also across the region, will not have a way of going back. So I think we need to really look at this from a very dynamic perspective, and we have to try to help ASEAN navigate a very complex landscape. Thank you.
Thanks, Lilian. I very like the approach of your presentations in which that you've described on the importance of understanding the gap and reality, so that in every concerted effort of ASEAN, it's totally targeted and it's definitely reached the outcome rather than is a talk shop with no directions in specific. But we'll go on to that on the Q&A later. Thank you for that. Now let's go on with the third speaker, or the third presenters of today's event that we have on stage, Ms. Mothusa. Mothusa is an ASEAN Fellow and a coordinator of the Myanmar Studies Program. She was previously a lead researcher at the ASEAN Studies Center at ICS. She joined ICS in 2008 after 10 years at the ASEAN Secretariat, heading the Human Development Unit in her last 3 years there. Mo has contributed to several Compendia volumes on ASEAN and on Myanmar. She was also part of the ASEAN Studies Center team engaged in Myanmar for its 2014 ASEAN Chairmanship. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Mothusa.
Good morning to everyone, and thank you, Zachary, for that very kind introduction. I'd also like to add my thanks to Ideas Malaysia for putting together this very timely and important discussion that really tries to connect the dots between what is being done, what the regional level is trying to do within the ASEAN framework, and how that is all probably going to translate down to the ground in the Myanmar context. I'd also like to thank both Eric and Lillian for setting the scene just now in that most excellent way of providing the broad framework, and also highlighting what regional cooperation can or cannot do, as well as the nature of negotiated compromise. And all the constraints of engaging rogue states, working in conflict and humanitarian assistance situations. So I think in the time that I have, I would like to focus what I will say, linking the regional to the national, as it were, to the situation in Myanmar. And I know Goh Kai Win, who's going to come after me, will add on more about the situation on the ground as well. So I'd like to start connecting that, the regional national dots a bit more. And I have maybe 4 main points or themes, if you will, to structure what I want to say. They are all S's: stability, statements, stakeholders, and substantive support, or the substance of support. So let me elaborate on those points. What do I mean when I talk about stability? Again, both Eric and Lillian have highlighted the kind of threat that this current Myanmar crisis poses to ASEAN's regional stability. Indeed, you could also say it strikes at its internal unity, regional centrality, and of course, international credibility. So they've both highlighted the importance of speaking with one voice once that negotiated compromise has been reached by dint of the discussions that take place. So not everyone gets what they want, but it is something that people can broadly agree on, and that is the context of the 5-point consensus. It's not something that each and every member state would have wanted or signed off on 100%, but it was something that they could all agree on to work together as the start of a process. So that's important to ensure that ASEAN is trying to work towards regional stability, work towards protecting and preserving regional stability by addressing the stability situation in one member state that threatens ASEAN's regional stability. But here again, stability also has to do with what's happening on the ground, because as we all know, the commitments that ASEAN makes, these commitments are regional. But when it comes to implementation of these regional commitments, that becomes a national responsibility. And this is the kind of challenge that both Eric and Lillian have also highlighted so eloquently. Domestic concerns affect the appetite for regional intervention as well as national level implementation. And in the context of Myanmar, if we look at it, we do see that the stability of the country, or the current instability, if you will, is presenting that additional facet of a challenge. Myanmar is facing right now a triple crisis. It's both a political, economic, and social crisis, let's face it. It's not just the protests or the civil disobedience movement, which is what most of the world sees on TV screens, on our mobile news updates, websites, and so on. But the crisis is more importantly how the communities in Myanmar, how society, the population of Myanmar is desperately trying to cope with the control that the junta is trying to assert in the name of law and order. You know, students and teachers now are boycotting the reopening of universities and schools, and the junta is retaliating by trying to force even private schools to reopen, and by dismissing educators or applying force on educators who are participating in the civil disobedience. So we are facing losing generations of young people disenfranchised of their right to education and other important rights. And let's not forget, COVID is raging still. And basic access to health and social services are practically non-existent now in Myanmar, particularly in the areas where fighting is going on with all the displaced communities. So we are talking about the stability of a country here that is desperately trying to hold on to its fabric, and yet it's crumbling because of that triple crisis of the political, economic, and social challenges placed in the wake of the February 1 illegal takeover. Now, the second point I want to make about statements, and building on to the observations that Eric and Lillian have made about evaluating the ASEAN 5-point consensus, and how have all the reactions been and the interpretations to this chairman's statement has. I agree with Eric that this is actually the start of a long-term process and a long-term commitment. And that long-term commitment is required of and from ASEAN, because let's face it, realistically, no other country or organization is willing to invest that much time and effort to work on and with Myanmar in trying to reach some kind of constructive settlement to this crisis, which has been, if I may say, decades in the brewing. It did not happen overnight, and therefore it will not go away overnight. So I think ASEAN is the default platform, default body to try to see through this long-term process with a long-term commitment. And of course, I think if we look at how the different statements in response to ASEAN's 5-point consensus has been on the ground in Myanmar, I would say that the National Unity Government has responded constructively and with gravitas. I am looking at the statement issued by the National Unity Government's Prime Minister, Umangwen Kaintan, on the National Unity Government's response to the 5-point consensus, where he has welcomed the ASEAN's constructive intent, and also stated the NUG's willingness to work constructively and consult with ASEAN in working through the different implementation points of the 5-point consensus, including the mission and mandate of the ASEAN envoy and how the composition of the ASEAN delegations would be, and also on the nature of who would be the key stakeholders in Myanmar to consult. So just contrast Prime Minister Manwan Kaintan's statement and response with what the State Administration Council has tried to qualify or backtrack. So I would argue here that the National Unity Government is in a good position to work with ASEAN to coordinate and consult with those key stakeholders across the country, including in the ethnic areas and nationalities. So I think we also need to look at the kind of statements that both the NUG and the SAC have issued, and the intent and the commitment behind those statements. You can see the contrast. Now, the third S I want to talk about is stakeholders. And we've been talking about how ASEAN can bring all the main stakeholders, both inside and outside the country, to the negotiating table. Now, at this point, I'd like to emphasize that rather than talk about a negotiating table, because I think there is no equality right now if we talk about bringing different parties to the negotiating table. The work of ASEAN is really going to be cut out on the ground, building on the points that Lillian has highlighted, because this requires a new kind of shuttle diplomacy that the ASEAN envoy and the ASEAN, different ASEAN delegation or team members need to do in Myanmar. It's shuttling among and between the different key stakeholders in Myanmar, as well as ASEAN governments, before we can even, I think, start talking about, bringing people together around a negotiating table. And why do I say this? Because let's look at it. We are talking about egos here. And who has the biggest ego that has caused this crisis to its present impasse and prolonging it? It's Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. It's not just his political ambitions, but it's also, I think, those long-held distrustful and negative attitudes towards the National League for Democracy, especially Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, as the embodiment of the military's nemesis over these past decades. And of course, more lately, we also have to think about how the military's egos and fear factors will be activated by the culpability concerns potentially that could be raised at the International Court of Justice. And we're also talking about the equality or esteem here. We can't move forward in this current polarized situation that we see in Myanmar because there is no parity of esteem. We see both the SAC and the NUG asserting that they have legitimacy, the SAC by virtue of controlling the organs of state power and wielding the might of lethal force, but the National Unity Government and the committee representing the Pidang Zulata by virtue of having the people's mandate from the 2020 elections, which the military junta has declared null and void. And both sides have declared the other terrorist or illegal, but legitimacy also cuts domestically. And this is important because the State Administration Council has not been able to justify how it can deliver on its initial statement of a more business-friendly economic climate and better governance than its predecessor, the NLD. And there are close to 800 killings going on now, despite the 5-point consensus. And the continuing civil disobedience movement and protests are continuing to affect key economic sectors. So we also need to think about how all this are going to translate into ASEAN's overall vision of a seamlessly integrated and connected region, of a people-centered, people-oriented community, when a member state is not in a position to honor or follow up on its ASEAN commitments, even for economic integration, not to mention the other parts of socio-cultural and political priorities. So this complicates the question of how the ASEAN facilitated process will go about trying to consult and find a common set of points, which could serve as a basis for facilitating that possible conversation. But as both Eric and Lillian have highlighted, this is going to be a long-term process that requires a lot of consultation by the envoys and the different ASEAN teams and the key stakeholders in Myanmar's political process. I think we need to hear, ASEAN needs to really, I think, talk to and consult the National Unity Government on who these key stakeholders are across civil society, across the ethnic armed groups, and also the different the religious and ethnic nationalities. So my last point about substantive support, and this relates to ASEAN's substantive centrality of mounting this proactive approach, and how ASEAN can serve as that platform of coordinating broader international support towards its efforts or its work in Myanmar. So here we're talking about engagement, really, and ASEAN's fallback position, of course, about not having an option, about not engaging, not being an option. I think this is very important here, because we are not conferring recognition by engaging. We are also trying to engage both sides of the political coin, not just the junta, but also the more representative National Unity Government. So even though I think critics of ASEAN will try to poke holes, I think we need to look at ASEAN's situation as not being without opportunities for gaining entry and foothold for that eventually wider space to operate. But the dilemma here, of course, is ASEAN even serving as the coordinating platform and engaging with the international community for helping Myanmar and its people, who to engage with, right? The state and do we engage the state and not the bodies that are both asserting? I don't think that's an option. And of course, how do we move away from all the decades-long entrenched ethnicity and identity-based politics? We need to look at what the National Unity Government is trying to do by pursuing both state building from the peripheries to the center, as well as peace building at the same time, with many moving parts and many different stakeholders at both the ethnic, local, and community levels. So we really need to look at how ASEAN and international partners can somehow use the ASEAN dialogue platforms to coordinate and collaborate in this process. Lillian has raised excellent points on the entry points and some of the challenges or the broader issues that we need to be alive to with regard to humanitarian assistance and support in the peripheries, particularly with regard to displaced persons and refugees. But I think we also need to look at, when we talk about engagement and substantive support, how do we help the National Unity Government become that essential counterpart for engagement in all of this, for the sake of the people of Myanmar, and for the sake of not losing any more generations going forward to bring Myanmar to realize the full potential that it has never been given the chance to realize up to now. I'll stop here, and I apologize if I've gone over time.
You are certainly not. We are very good with time. Thank you, Mo, for the presentations. Now, our most presentation is focusing on connecting the dots, and it's a very good observation that we need to actually have a linkage between the regional effort as well as the national effort, and that's where the gap comes from. Thank you for that approach. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let us now go to the last presenter. We have Mr. Kind Wind. Kind Wind earned his BA in English from Yangon University and Masters in Public Policy from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, NUS. He worked at the Department of English in Yangon University from 1991 to 1995, and also have worked with diplomatic missions, international NGOs, donor agency for more than 10 years in various capacity. Now, interestingly, in 2008, he founded an organization called Sandy Governance Institute with the purpose of nurturing leadership for promoting good governance, and since time he is working as an executive director of these organizations. With that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kind Wind to the stage. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I would like to express my thanks to IDEA for inviting me to this panel. Actually, I don't need to talk a lot about Myanmar coup, because the previous speaker panelists already discussed a lot about our country's situation. But I will continue to connect the dots between domestic politics and ASEAN and regional diplomacy. I think ASEAN needs to understand domestic politics and the people's desire. It's very important, I think, because right now, let me explain a little bit about the context of the inside situation. Actually, people as the NUG Foreign Minister Zimmermann said at the National UN Security Council meeting. So people are actually determined to pay any price, any cost to remove the military dictatorship for good. So that's the people's actually determination. because actually emotions, the public emotions are run really, really high. So the people, most of the people, if you talk, actually the media, you can also listen to the media. The many people in different parts of the country, they are saying that in our generation, we have to get rid of the military dictatorship. So we by all means, and we are ready to pay any price, any cost. That's the kind of determination I have never seen in my life. So actually, people are actually really, really paying the big price. So even after the ASEAN special meeting on 24th, military continue to perpetrate actually violence very, 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 very cruelly. Actually, on Sunday, one famous poet, he was taken from his home on Saturday. Within 12 hours, he was found dead at the hospital. But many people from his hometown, they actually they attended his funeral ceremony, and then they protested. So actually, protests will go on. You cannot you cannot. No one can. No military cannot control the situation. So that's why I think it's very important for ASEAN to understand the to understand the public sentiments and domestic politics, because of the public sentiments and public demands, NUG also has a lot of constraint to engage and to negotiate, and then I think I need to emphasize that ASEAN also needs to understand the regime's characteristic. Already the previous speakers already talk about it, but I think I need to no I need to repeat again, because in public opinion, military is using ASEAN to its advantage. Not actually not it, the military is not honest. They don't have any desire to reach a consensus, to open or to open dialogue with the opposition or something like that. They are actually their strategy is to delay and to divide and conquer. Actually, both domestically and regionally, they are playing this tactics. I think so. They were divide ASEAN, and they were divide ethnic group, something like that. And they have actually, that's why. And then, but Myanmar people, the people, all the citizens in Myanmar, they understand their strategy, their cunningness very, very well. So that's why I think the Miss Lillian also already already talked about it. ASEAN must prove that it is impartial, respect people's will. Otherwise, ASEAN will lose its integrity, because as you all maybe you may have already seen in the comments on online. So Myanmar people are very disappointed with ASEAN general public. So they don't know about their general public. They don't know about diplomacy, or they don't know much about their international politics, international relation. But what they what they what they understand is that nobody will care for us. So we have to uh, resolve our problem by ourselves. No one will help us or something like that. That attitude, but that attitude is actually very dangerous, very risky, I think, because now, as you said, that people will take up in some segment of the society, in some places, people people take up. They are not actually arms. They don't have arms and ammunition, but maybe they just take up knives or something like that, and they try to fight back the military, because it's not because people are actually want to take the violent means. But because the military is perpetrating violence, and then they're using violence disproportionately. That's why actually people have no choice but to take up arms. So that's why I think humanitarian disaster and then civil war, the country is heading towards a failed state. And then you talk about all the panelists also discuss about humanitarian assistance, uh, and humanitarian, but people actually they don't care about humanitarian assistance because people understand that humanitarian assistance will not resolve this long-lasting problem, the military dictatorship problem. We have to, we have to, it's like a humanitarian assistance. It will be a symptomatic treatment. It cannot address the root cause. So that's why people don't. So people are right now also, many people, they are helping each other. They are helping each other because now actually economy is collapsing. As you can see that banks are collapsing. We cannot withdraw money. Actually, they impose limits on withdrawal. So it's a man-made disaster. It's not natural disaster. So that's very, very, very complex. They will also use the humanitarian system to their advantage. So they have already destroyed all the charitable charities. They don't need, even they attack, they attack ambulances and medical teams, and they raided, free funeral services. So we don't have no, uh, we don't have the civil society space to deliver humanitarian assistance effectively. So if the military control the humanitarian assistance, they will use it for their advantage. So that's a problem. That's why I think that even to deliver ASEAN to deliver humanitarian assistance inside, it's very, very difficult, and and because neutrality, impartiality, these humanitarian principles, I think it's very difficult for ASEAN to enforce. So the military will not also, I think, accept accept ASEAN humanitarian assistance because they cannot abide by these principles. For them, for example, if you deliver assistance to the CDM people, they will consider it as actually non-neutral because you are providing assistance to the opposition group or something like, and then they will rate it. So, and then on the other hand, also people will see it if you deliver humanitarian assistance through government control Congos, NGOs. So people will not be happy. People maybe that will also complicate matters further. And that's why no, I agree with Mamu that the stability. So in what sense? What does it mean stability for Myanmar people? So they are actually looting. They are people inside. No one feels safe. Even in Yangon, even in Mandalay, because we don't actually feel safe, and even at home, they are raiding. They are raiding houses, and then they are looting our properties, money and the gold, jewelry, everything they found when they came into the room. So they break into the houses and apartments, and so that's we don't have any sort of stability. So when you are talking about stability, that's very important. I think that so our country is heading towards failed state, and then the spillover effects of all the instability in Myanmar will be very, 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 very huge. As you have already mentioned, that drugs trafficking, human trafficking, Rohingya issue, and all these issues will come up and have a problem. At the same time, that I think that the ASEAN also, that's why ASEAN needs to engage with multi stakeholders, not only with people's. Right now, people think that ASEAN is only engaging with one side. That is the perpetrator, not the victim. ASEAN is not engaging with the victims. Actually, the NUG, CRPH, they are victims of the military dictatorship. They are not perpetrator. And especially the one sentence in the 5-point consensus, the first clause, exercise restraint. Both sides should exercise restraint. That's actually people are really upset because we are not perpetrator, we are victims, but the people think that people see it as putting a blame on the victim, something like that. So I think that ASEAN needs to be aware of these domestic politics, and then I think that ASEAN must prove that it is engaging with all the stakeholder. In engaging with all the stakeholder, it must prove that it is fair, it is neutral, it is not taking a side, taking a side with the military. That's very important. I think that, and then substantive support. Mahmoud already talked about substantive support, substantive assistance. So when we talk about substantive uh, assistance, the political settlement, political people actually want to see the military step down. Maybe maybe you will say that it's impossible. Yeah, we agree that, but we want to. No? We want to the aim of the ASEAN and other multilateral multilateral institutions, UN, United Nations, and other big big countries such as China, India. The people want them to address the root cause of the conflict, not the symptom. I think that's very very important. Substantive support, not humanitarian assistance. We know that now people are desperately in need of assistance, and there are food shortages, and then the UN also, UNDP also published a report recently that the poverty rate can increase to more than nearly 50%, 24 million people. But actually, that's actually the humanitarian assistance will not address, will not actually reduce poverty in our country. It will only, I think, may prolong poverty in our country. That's why people are saying that banking crisis and then economic crisis, all these things are actually can be attributed to the military. It's the issue come up because of military actually very savage, no? Very savage actions. So that's why I think that for their partner, actually best alternative to negotiate this settlement is to continue to hold on to power, because now already they have committed a lot of crimes. They have committed a lot of crimes, and people are calling on the international community to charge them at International Criminal Court, International Criminal ICJ, ICC. So for them, I think that best alternative to negotiated settlement is continue to hold on to power. So that's why it's very difficult to make compromise with the military. So I'm thinking all the time. So for both sides, so deadlock, and then I appreciate that ASEAN is trying its utmost to address the issue, to negotiate and to calm down the situation, but it's very difficult. But for me, I think that for their partner to change their partner, maybe the international community, including ASEAN, must give a clear signal to them. No? You must change your behavior. You must change your behavior. You must stop it. You must stop violence. Or else, if you don't, no, if ASEAN doesn't want to deal, and if ASEAN doesn't want to call a snake, I think it will not. ASEAN efforts to help reach a political settlement will not be successful. I think that's why I think that connecting the dot, linking domestic politics, domestic context with regional diplomacy, it's very important. In my opinion, ASEAN must first and foremost, ASEAN must prove that it's a neutral negotiator, mediator. It's an impartial institution. Although although the Myanmar people understand that ASEAN has also different interests, but no, at the same time, I think first and foremost, it must improve. It must prove that it is impartial, and secondly, it must understand the regime characteristic. They will say one thing today and then change next day. They will they will not keep the promise. So in any venues, they are actually they are liars. They are liars. So that regime characteristic you need to understand. And number three, actually you need to the ASEAN needs to engage with all the stakeholder. That's why I think that ASEAN needs to talk to NUG, CRPH, ethnic armed organization, and civil society group. It's very important, I think. And then ASEAN must actually try to change their partner. Right now, their partner is holding on to power by all means. They are actually they will do everything. Within 3 months, they have already destroyed the economy and health system, health and education, everything. Everything we have built now in the past 10 years, within 3 months, they have destroyed. They are ready to do it. They will go extreme. They don't care. I think that's a reality. I think our country is more similar to Venezuela than Syria. But I think maybe, yeah, in the next 2 or 3 years, the civil war can occur. Thank you very much. That's all for.
Thank you, Kind Wind, for enlightening us on the domestic context and how actually that we can marry the domestic context with regional diplomacy. It's very refreshing to know what's happening on the ground when it comes to the domestic politics, the people desire, as well as the regime characteristics in Myanmar itself. Thank you to all panelists for your insights and your extensive presentations. I can see there are various approaches that we have generated from this discussion today, and definitely it'll be valuable to all our listeners and viewers out there. Now, before we go on to the Q&A sessions, allow me just to recap to the points that we have made, or the points that have been generalized by all of the panelists. Now, Eric Paulson talks about the historical background on how this Myanmar conflict has incepted into the country, and as well as how the ASEAN has played its role. The 5-point consensus is our guide point on how that we can move further. Lillian talks about the gap and reality. How do we actually match all these two things with what's happening in Myanmar as well as the regional diplomacy? I liked your point where this is quite unprecedented for ASEAN. ASEAN probably has not dealt with this kind of gravity of experience before, therefore that we need to generate new measures for ASEAN to solve this issue in Myanmar as well as in the region. Now, Mo talks about connecting the dots. Now, her approach is actually how to connect what's happening in the region and what's happening in the country by looking at 4 elements, which are the stability, statements, stakeholders, as well as substantial points. Yeah, so I think this is how that we can actually understand how what's happening in Myanmar that's also implicating the region. And I think one important interesting point that you've touched is actually on how this crisis gives birth to the lost generation, where education is severely distorted and disturbed in Myanmar at the moment. Our last panelist, Kind Win, talks about the domestic context and regional diplomacy. It's a good for us to know what's happening on the political arena in Myanmar, the people's desire, the regime characteristics, and it's quite touching actually when our friends in Myanmar has been limited to withdraw money. We can see that how this economic life has also been disturbed by this crisis. And Kind also suggests that ASEAN should change their partners and engage with more stakeholders, especially on the victims on the ground, on getting more insights for us to create more actions in the future. So that's what I could gather from my notes from all of the panel's presentations. Now, allow me just to go to the questions raised by our viewers and listeners out there. This is the first time I'm looking at the questions, so probably if I'm able to understand the questions correctly and address it to our panelists, that would be great. All right, now we have the first questions from John. Would you agree that with its current iron grip on the national economy, the Myanmar military regime has zero incentive to change the status quo, so long as its main economic and ideological sponsor is steadfast in supporting it? So we were talking about what is the actual or the everlasting intention of the Myanmar military regime. I think the question is best to be answered by Mo and Kind. If I may go to Mo first, and then I'll go to Kind to answer on this question.
Yes, okay. Thank you, John, for those observations. That allows me to elaborate a bit more on what I talked about, egos and interests of the junta. If you look at the military over all these decades, I think they have not evolved from that notion or the view that they had of themselves since independence, since the post-1948 days, where it meant something to be a member of the Burma Independence Army. It meant something to have fought for one's country's independence from occupiers, and it meant something to be in a profession or a career that garnered some respect. But all that changed after 1958. And with the military takeover or orchestrated in 1962 by General Ne Win, where essentially the privileging or the foregrounding of military interest above all else sets the country on its current path. And of course, we saw the economic collapse that happened, that led to the pro-democracy protests and movement in 1988, and all those long decades of military entrenched rule in the name of law and order, where again, the military tried to further entrench its survival via the economic means. That's where they set up all these military-owned and operated state-owned enterprises through which any form of investment needed to be channeled through in those early years of the so-called generals opening up the country for economic liberalization and so on. And those military-owned and operated enterprises continue in operation to this day because of maybe the elements of some kind of power sharing agreement that had to be worked out, when more civilianized control of the government machinery was transitioned. And of course, you know, this is the constraint that the National League for Democracy government has always faced, in terms of never really being in, I think, full charge or control of all the sectors of government, right? The 2008 constitution basically gave the military, the commander-in-chief, the right to nominate the Minister for Defense, for Home Affairs, and for Border Affairs. These are the key ministries that have to do with security in the country. So as long as this regime, this junta, this military views their own security, conflating it with state security and economic security, we're going to have this again and again and again. So I guess this is just my longer way of agreeing with you that, you know, these are the entrenched interests that the military has always tried to foreground and privilege itself over the decades. But as Goh Kai Nguyen has pointed out, this is an unprecedented moment in the country's history where we are actually seeing people transcending a lot of lines, class, gender, race, religion, ethnicity lines, to really voice this very strong desire to do away with this outsized role of the military in the country's political and economic life. But because the entrenchment has been for decades, this is the challenge that we have to face.
Mo, very quickly on your point that you raised, that the military interest is above all, and that's the nature of existence of the military. Now, is this constitutional to begin with, that for the military to put its interest above the national interest, above the people's interest?
So, they've stacked the constitution several times. I mean, in 1974, there was this so-called socialist constitution that also tried to scope all of these things in the context of socialism, and they got away with it. And in 2008, despite the devastating impact of Cyclone Nargis, the then military regime also pushed through a referendum to entrench the 2008 constitution, under which political framework even the National League for Democracy, rejoining the political process, had to somehow accept and work within those very constraining circumstances.
All right, thank you. That's quite alarming, actually, but thank you for your explanation. Kind, what do you think? What is the nature of the existence of the military in Myanmar?
Actually, they see themselves as guardian, legitimate guardian of the country, legitimate ruler of the country. They don't actually they don't care about whether people give the legitimacy to them or not, but they consider themselves as the ultimate guardian of the country. So they think that they are fair. They have to build up military industrial complex, because it is actually they are the military leaders are using these ideology to entrench their interests for their interests. But ideologically, they are saying that they are the only legitimate ruler, so that everything they do, everything they invented is fair, something like that. That's why they inserted the clauses in the 2008 constitution. Actually, 2008 constitution is not constitutional, but we have to accept it, because we have to accept these are military holdings, they are they are outright control on 3 ministries, because we want to move away from the past. But actually, in my opinion, their ambition is to continue to rule the country by the military in another name for another century, another century. That's why they accepted the 2008 constitution. They drafted it and they accepted it, and then they held 2 elections in 2010. At that time, NLD and then NLD was not allowed to contest. And then, but they might have thought that that kind of actually pseudo civilian government, can they well go on? They will win. No? They will win the election in 2015. They will win the election in 2020. But they realized that after losing 2 elections, they realized that gradually their entrenched power will decline, and then their business interests will be affected, because NLD, because in this the term, in the next term, NLD government, they have to initiate the substantive reform. They cannot pick no, they cannot pick the low-hanging fruits. They have to do what the economics call second generation reforms, something like that, more substantive. That means that we have to we have to formulate, the government must formulate laws, not laws and rules and regulation that will control these laws and rules and regulation will control the military industrial complex. So it's also, yeah, I think that's why also one of the reasons for staging a coup is that their interests are being affected by NLD's and NLD's reform. For example, the EITI, no? EITI, an extractive industry transparency initiative, they have to disclose beneficiary ownership. So everywhere they are involved, both listed and illicit business activities. That's why at the same time, they are actually see their weakest point is economy. So if we can, actually, if the regional country, especially I think Singapore, because most of their accounts are open in Singapore, so they have billions of dollars in their personal accounts in Singapore. So if if ASEAN as a whole, or if individual country can impose the financial economic sanction, targeted economic sanction effectively, but Western sanction, US and EU sanctions are not adequate. Actually, that's why I think that ASEAN has leverage, particularly Singapore, because actually they open companies in Singapore, and then they reinvest in Myanmar. Actually, the Singaporean company belongs to the military, so they form joint venture with our Singapore company. So many. So justice for Myanmar. One activist group is disclosing these confidential finds, and then and not only Singapore, but the Japan, Korea, they also have regional countries in the East Asia and then Saudi Asia and China. I think they have a lot of leverage on the military, because they care about their money, and then if their economic interests are effective, maybe they will come to the negotiating table. That's why I think financial sanction now, and some scholars, they said in the past that sanctions were not effective, but actually blanket sanctions are not effective, but targeted sanctions are effective. That's why the only way to bring them to the negotiating table is, so actually affect their interests, make them weaker. But actually, I always tell my friend that we must empower the people. So weaken the military and empower the people. That's I think fundamental principle that all the organization, ASEAN, and then other country also should adopt. So it's very important. Unless they are weak, they will not come to the negotiating table. That's why I think that, so we should target their economic interests.
Thank you. Thank you. I think both of your answers seems to suggest that the military does not have any intention to change the status quo and would like to remain as it is for the next hundred of years of ruling the country. And I think, your last answers on the financial embargo and financial limitations to the Myanmar leaders is also the questions that I would like to ask Eric. Because there's a questions by Andrew Coup. Obviously, first, thank you for your remarks. But isn't the critical point here that there is no express provision in the 5 points that ASEAN will talk to the NUG itself? And what is Singapore doing to prevent the military from having access to its bank account, medical facilities, and other assets in Singapore? Eric, this question is directly to you. And yes, please take the floor.
Thank you for the question. Regarding economic sanctions, ASEAN or any ASEAN member states will just not going to do it because that's not how ASEAN works. ASEAN, the founding purpose of ASEAN is for economic cooperation and for political security, and then we have the ASEAN Charter, but I really don't foresee any sort of sanctions will be imposed by ASEAN as a whole or even any ASEAN member states. That would answer your question regarding Singapore or any other country in ASEAN that would take unilateral action against Myanmar. Regarding the NUG, yes, I agree. It would have been better if ASEAN had, from the very beginning, included NUG in the negotiations. But again, ASEAN, as you all know, it consists of all 10 member states. It cannot speak separately, even though some individual countries did. But to be effective, they have to speak as a whole, so that there's ASEAN unity. And the 5 points are the basic consensus that they've agreed upon. But it's just, I think it's quite obvious that the NUG at this moment is not being seen to represent the Myanmar people just yet. But I would assume that in the coming weeks and months ahead, that is why it's very important for the ASEAN envoy to be appointed as soon as possible, and so that the ASEAN envoy and also ASEAN must as a whole also must be able to reach out separately to the NUG, and I think the special envoy has a particular delicate role to try to balance the competing interests, because obviously there will be objections from various quarters, and that is why I've stressed for a flexible mandate, so that all stakeholders, relevant parties, and especially NUG must be consulted for the future of Myanmar.
So what's your take, Eric, on the monetary sanctions? Do you think that it's not a priority at the moment, or should we just not to let that happen, considering that there is also a need of diplomacy at this particular time?
It is. I think it's not possible. It is not something that is being considered by ASEAN and or any individual ASEAN member states. For me, look, you just need to look at previous ASEAN practices. So ASEAN has existed more than 50 years. Of course, we are at the uncharted territory. Whatever that's happened in ASEAN, in Myanmar, it's at a scale that is not seen before. But I think if you look at past practices, it would guide us as to what we can expect from ASEAN. And I think some of the expectations are beyond what is possible. But nonetheless, I feel that ASEAN is nonetheless the best option that is available, the most realistic option that is available, and that's what we have now. And I think the international community is currently looking at ASEAN to move forward. Of course, at the end of the day, whether this is something that the Myanmar people want, as Kyrene had said very, very strongly and very, very eloquently, the Myanmar people wants different things. They want the Tatmadaw to step down. They want the democratic elected government to be reinstalled. So this is something not for ASEAN to impose. It's for all stakeholders to decide whether this is something that is achievable, whether it is something that is realistic. And this, unfortunately, will be a long process ahead. There are no quick solution. And I certainly don't think there'll be a quick return to democracy. You can just ask the Tatmadaw to step down and then you expect them to just step down. You can impose targeted sanction as much as you want. And that has been done by the West. But I think Asian countries, regional powers, they are unlikely to do so. And I think, I've said it in my earlier presentation, the UN Security Council, this is at the very highest level, at the UN level. They have met at least 3 times formally, and I think informally they have also met like twice. And I think this is again quite unprecedented because the Myanmar crisis is 3 months old, and the UN Security Council has met so many times, and nonetheless there is a deadlock because the political reality is China and Russia will not allow for more coercive measures. That is just the reality. And the further reality is Myanmar surrounding borders are Thailand, China, and India. And if you look at the political reality again, these countries would never close the door to Myanmar and whoever that is politically in power, whether it's a civilian government or the military government. That is just the reality. So I hope ASEAN can play a role that will be supported by the Myanmar people. But again, like I said, ultimately, the future of Myanmar is in the hands of the Myanmar people. Thank you.
Let me jump in for a few minutes. Actually, we are aware of the fact that ASEAN will not impose economic sanctions or financial sanctions because only ASEAN's country will only abide by the UN Security Council resolution. That's we understand. But I think ASEAN country and individually or as a whole, they can convey the message to the military that if you continue to perpetrate violence and if you continue to behave like that, your economic interests will be affected, because right now also I think that they are actually destroying themselves, their economic interests. For example, like the investment now investment withdrew from their economic holding, military owned companies, something like that, including Singaporean company. The stock prices can fall down, and then you can actually, I think that not in economic sanctions, but in other ways. In other ways, the ASEAN countries can convey the message to the military and maybe squeeze squeeze them, because practically also, for example, a big infrastructure investment project, they cannot come in because of political risk very high. So it's, I think, even for the Chinese investor, it's actually almost impossible to invest in long-term infrastructure project. That's why I think that maybe collectively ASEAN can convey the message to the military. Thank you, Eric.
All right, thank you both. Now, let's talk a bit about refugees and the people. So Lilian, one of the problems about the NUG is that they have not said anything about the Rohingya. While now Susanna, the NUG Minister of Women and Children, has personally apologized for ignoring the Rohingya issues, there has been no formal acknowledgement or any apology from the NUG about this. Now, this in turn has led to several US Congress members not being prepared to recommend recognition of the NUG. Now, how will this failure affect sentiments on the grounds and the way forward in actually achieving inter-ethnic unity against the Tatmadaw? Your opinion, please, Lilian.
Thank you. I think that question was from Andrew. So thank you, Andrew, for that really important question. I think it's important to understand that the crisis which is most well known in the region or internationally, from the many issues in Myanmar and the many types of conflicts and complicated crises in Myanmar, has been the Rohingya issue. And I think that it still puzzles a lot of people internationally. There's still very little grasp of why this issue is so complex internally and why it's viewed in a different way. And I think that it's a long kind of historical, political analysis that one needs to do, but I think that what we can say now is that we're at a moment of opportunity to rethink some of these fundamental questions about belonging, about who has a legitimate claim to nationality, what nationality looks like, and perhaps even going as far, if the people of Myanmar are ready, to try to de-link citizenship from ethnicity. And I think that that's actually a critical issue because I think so many post-colonial states, including Malaysia, we inherited political entities that codified ethnicity or race or religion, and these were products of very painful colonial histories. And in fact, I think they've caused in many countries, and certainly in Myanmar, I think at an astronomical scale, a lot of suffering and a lot of difficulty in us ever realizing issues like equality, and looking at now, of course, we have all these international standards and models that we try to aspire to, the Sustainable Development Goals. How do you talk about inclusion if the very basis of our nation states continue to be about who belongs and who doesn't, continue to be divided along those roles? I think what's really interesting in Myanmar now, it's not to blame people. I think what's important is looking forward. And I think that this is what the Rohingya would like to see. The Rohingya want to see that there's a recognition that the past system and that there are elements of, the past, previous laws. And I think in particular, the 1982 citizenship law is really one of the key things that they're thinking about, that this is an opportunity to rethink those discriminatory legal frameworks, which in fact were put in place by the military, right, in a different, a different manifestation of the military. But I think that because this is such a revolutionary moment for the Myanmar people, and it's such a moment where, alliances, which weren't always there, and it's not just with the Rohingya, the relationship between the Burman majority and some of the other ethnic minorities, not just because of differences in ethnicity, but politically, the political histories have been complicated. And I think that because of that, it's a moment for renegotiating those relationships. And I think what's important to the Rohingya is that they're part of that conversation. There was a letter that was sent to the NUG signed by 31 Rohingya organizations. And they are showing full support for this democratic change. They want to be part of the support of federal democracy, but they also want to be at the table. They want to be included in the consultative council of the NUG. They want to push for the NUG to recognize that a lot of the efforts that the Rohingya have been working towards, which is the accountability efforts of the ICJ, and also now the push of the ICC, that those issues could actually strengthen the NUG's case as well. So how do you strategically look at building those types of alliances and recognizing that genocide took place or crimes against humanity took place? Looking at how actually to be more strategic, looking at they've been demanding the signing of a Rome Statute as well by the NUG. So there are all these commitments, I think, which the Rohingya would like to see, to talk about not just let's get rid of the Tatmadaw and let's take over and let's look for recognition, but it's really about looking at a new constitutional order, which is what a lot of people in Myanmar are asking for too. Stronger international guarantees and transitional justice. So these are the types of issues which the Rohingya are prioritizing, and I do believe that the NUG is discussing this. I've heard that the NUG is taking this seriously, but there's yet to be, indeed an official position. But I do think that there are some people in the NUG who are in fact very, quite attuned and sympathetic to this. So I think that it's important. And it's not just about the Rohingya. This is about principles of inclusivity, right? I think that's the important point as well. Yeah, so I think that, if we're talking about, these are the issues which have generated, they've actually led to, if we just talk about the Rohingya crisis only, we are talking about fundamental problems with the Myanmar, sense of belonging, and also not just that, but also the tolerance of impunity, right? The fact that there was so little criticism in 2017 and 18 when, even though the Rohingya crisis has been going on for many years, and many other obviously crises in Myanmar, but the level of violence that took place in Rakhine State against this minority was so great, and there was so little criticism from the public. And I think that's what really terrifies the Rohingya, the fact that there was no solidarity, hardly any, or those who were willing to stand in solidarity would not do it publicly because they were so fearful. So that's a terrifying thing to go through. And I think that that really needs to be understood, that it's not easy to forget that. The Rohingya are ready to forgive that because they understand that this is part of the military's divide and rule. But I think forgetting it is not easy, and therefore the commitments are needed. So this is, the critical issues about the Rohingya inclusion.
All right, thanks. Now, let's go quickly to the Myanmar's people perceptions towards ASEAN. There's a question here to Kynwin and Mo. Apart from the Singapore financial links, there are also reported close relationships between Thai military government and Tatmadaw interests. Are there other links like these that are also the reason Myanmar people getting very disappointed with ASEAN, both as a grouping and also individual neighboring countries that still empower the Tatmadaw directly or indirectly? Mo, if you'd like to take this question.
Thank you, Zachary, and thank you to Mr. Kamal for the question. I'd like to probably differentiate here about, perceptions toward ASEAN and perceptions toward, individual member states of ASEAN. If you talk about bilateral relations between Burma, Myanmar, and Thailand, I mean, that has its different dynamics since centuries ago. So definitely the attitudes and perceptions of the people in Myanmar towards Thailand, and how successive governments in Thailand have been dealt with or engaged with successive administrations of Myanmar will take a different tone. And I think the perceptions of the Myanmar people towards ASEAN, as Goh Kai Win has also highlighted right now, I think, and building on what Lillian also emphasized, there is this tendency probably to conflate ASEAN as one and see ASEAN as, this monolithic entity speaking with one voice, which, in reality, we know it's not. But the people in Myanmar are learning this gradually in this current situation. So I think we need to differentiate how people in Myanmar view ASEAN, the institution, the process, as the representative or collective whole of ASEAN member states individually. And I think the recognition is there that certain ASEAN member states like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore have spoken out more strongly in the context of this crisis than, say, others have been. And then there's a certain level of appreciation there. But that does not detract from the fact that overall ASEAN's, I think, decision or engagement or the optics of what ASEAN is doing still needs some time to be processed back home. A senior Myanmar diplomat once told me, and I've never forgotten this, we can choose our friends, but we can't choose our neighbors. So I think this perception also colors how the different ways that people in Myanmar will view neighbors, as well as other countries in the region, in that sense. I'll let Goh Kai Win talk more about the details.
actually people are also learning how to engage with neighboring countries, and then I think gradually they 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 they, they, they have learned a lot, and when we are talking about engaging and relationship interest, I think we need to distinguish between government to government level and people to people level. I think so we have actually uh, that's why we have to uh, tell the people that you must distinguish between government and the people in ASEAN or people in China, because in our country the Chinese sentiments are also very high, especially in Upper Burma. So generally speaking, no, sorry for that, apology for that statement. Actually, people in Myanmar, we see neighboring country as exploitative. Yeah, so they are exploiting our natural resources and taking advantage of the military dictatorship, something like that. But at the same time that we blame on the military, not on the neighbors actually. Because we always say that because our own parents are not good, that's why we have to suffer. We are being exploited by the outsider, something like that. But in this situation also, we need to distinguish between the people and the government and business interests. So now people are gradually learning that the maybe government has the neighboring countries government, they have different interests. uh, these interests are different from their public's interest, and then business entities also, they have their own interests. These interests are not the same as the people in the ASEAN countries or China's interest. So we are learning a lot. That's why I think that a lot of homework needs to be done and then engage. That's why I think that NUG must also develop strategies for engaging with neighboring country and China and India. So they must formulate good foreign policy. It's very important, but at the same time that we need to also convey the message to the respective government that so our public, the Myanmar people's sentiments and public opinions are different from the business interests. Usually, I think even Western business interests, they only listen to the business people. That's sometimes I think that's why they make wrong decision. For example, now the Euro Chamber in Myanmar, they always they issues updates almost every day, economic updates. But they say that banks are opening and everything is fine, something like that. Banks are opening, bank branches are opening, but actually banks are not carrying out their functions. They cannot actually they cannot function very well. They cannot function even maybe 20% of their normal functions. They are carrying out something like that. That's why I think that the government, ASEAN government also, they need to talk to different uh, interest group and also collect information. That's I think that's very important. Both sides need to learn from each other.
Sorry, Zachary. Go Kai-Wen makes a very important point that I just like to link back to what's happening at the ASEAN level as well. This goes back to the whole discussion about transparency and accountability and the kind of information that is available to the citizens and the populace of all our countries in this region. When we talk about being communicating these important initiatives that relate to the nation's development and everything and to economic progress. It is the way that economic decisions or important decisions related to the future of the people are communicated or consulted with the communities that stand to either lose, gain, or be affected from these decisions. And this is something that is a challenge ASEAN-wide at every level. So in the context of Myanmar, of course, I think the added challenge also is the way that the people in Myanmar have had access or not to this kind of information. Right now, I think we're all faced with a barrage of information, and it's also difficult to process or analyze what's going on. But this is also due to the fact that for decades and decades and decades, a certain entity in Myanmar has always tried to scope these kinds of decisions and information with regard to economic investments and extractive projects in a certain way that has also skewed, I think, national perceptions to the point where there's a lot of conflation going on. So I just like to highlight that I think what's happening in Myanmar, if we're talking about these kinds of communications and information with regard to the lives of people affected by important economic and investment related decisions, we need to also look at how those how that is communicated to the people and the communities who will be affected by it.
All right, thank you. We've been receiving a lot of questions. Thank you to all our viewers, attendees and participants to this online discussion. We truly appreciate that. But in the interest of time, we just have 10 minutes left, and I have to be very selective as what questions that can be at the moment. But nevertheless, all of good questions. Now, I have a question, and I mean, it's from Dylan S. Raju, and I think this question applies to all right? And perhaps we should get each of the panelists' opinion when it comes to this question. Yeah, perhaps this will be the concluding questions of all our presentation and discussions today. Now, do you think that we will at some point in time arrive at a conclusion that ASEAN simply does not have what it takes to effectively and efficiently deal with the issue in Myanmar? If yes, who do we look to then to solve this crisis? What is our plan B if ASEAN is not working out for this? So I think I will go on to all speakers to answer these questions. Lillian has started to type. Perhaps, Lillian, you already got your answers. I can see that you're retracting from typing. So Lillian, would you like to go first then, please?
Sure, I think it's a great question. And I think that we need to be humble and realize that there's no entity, this is not just about ASEAN, there is no single entity in the world right now that is going to be able to solve this Myanmar issue. And I also don't think the solutions are going to come from outside ultimately. I think, you know, the outside, the international community, whether it's ASEAN, whether it's the UN Security Council, whether it's some other iteration, can play a role, and their roles will be defined by, you know, what their mandates allow them to do, what the capacities are, what their expertise is, and what the political will is. But I mean, I think we need to recognize that the international community as a whole does not have the right mechanisms to deal with crimes against humanity, with violence against civilians, you know, even humanitarian protection against, you know, of civilians in times of conflict. I mean, these are all things which are being violated across the board in so many countries. You know, the protection of health workers and, you know, the sanctity of hospitals, for example. I mean, all of these things are violated over and over and over again. In the context of Myanmar, you know, it's unfortunate, but I don't see that if, you know, internationally we couldn't intervene in Rwanda, we couldn't intervene in, I mean, for protection, right? Not politically, but for protection. In places like Syria, we can't stop, you know, we can't stop hospitals from being bombed in those countries. You know, in protection of civilians in Yemen, we just don't have the tools internationally, and much less so regionally. You know, regionally, of course, we don't even work on these issues. You know, we don't even have, I mean, Eric knows this very well, you know, our human rights framework is one that it's taken so long for ASEAN to even get this far in having, you know, an intergovernmental committee on a commission on human rights, and even to get issues discussed. And you know, recently Eric and other colleagues at ICHA were able to discuss the Myanmar issue at a formal ICHA meeting, that itself is a huge step forward. So I don't think we should have unrealistic expectations. So, but it's not about, if ASEAN's not up to the job, who else can do it? Nobody can do it. I mean, honestly, there's not a single mechanism internationally that allows for protection of civilians, for, I think unless we're calling for regime change, and I think we all know the history of that in, the most kind of interventionist sort of ways, and I don't think anybody wants that. Certainly, most people in this region would not want to see that, and I think that it's important that we help the people of Myanmar who are facing this absolutely devastating, situation, which is terrifying, which is at the same time, this opening which gives them a moment of hope, and they feel, betrayed by people who don't stand by them. I think that we need to help them work through understanding what to expect from different stakeholders. What can be expected from ASEAN, what can be expected from others, and also what needs its own time to generate. I don't think that there are any easy solutions to this, and certainly the solutions are not ultimately going to come from outsiders.
All right, Eric, your opinion, please.
Thank you. I think it's a great way to end this seminar. I would fully agree with Lillian. There are really no mechanism available in this whole world to address the issue the way ideally we want to address it. And I think sometimes ASEAN is a convenient punching bag because of the nature of how ASEAN was set up. There is an issue of consensus and non-interference, and normally statements get watered down, and it's not agile in terms of its decision-making process. But I think I think for this particular crisis, I don't think people realize the amount of work that has been put into it, the amount of diplomatic effort by Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, and also Brunei in issuing the statements, in convening the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, and also the special summit. This is currently at the top priority for ASEAN, even though it is business as usual for other meetings. But nonetheless, the Myanmar crisis is not going away. There is the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting that is coming up. There's an ASEAN Summit. There's the ASEAN Regional Forum. There's the East Asia meeting, etc. So there's numerous meetings that are coming up where ASEAN would have to deal with the reality, the elephant in the room. How, where Myanmar is going. If Myanmar continues the downslide to a failed state or a humanitarian disaster, if the 5-point consensus are not being adhered to, and if violence continue, at some point, I think ASEAN would have to make some tough decisions. But I think we must give them a realistic timeline, because unilaterally imposing deadlines and timelines and insisting parties do this or that, in reality, it will not work. This is not a Hollywood movie or a Netflix series whereby international leaders gather, in a meeting room, and then there's tough negotiations, there's some arm twisting, and then suddenly a political solution is found and the world is safe. It just doesn't work that way. And as the leader has said, look at Syria, look at Yemen, and all the killings and starvation and state collapse that has happened, and everyone is not focusing on the crisis at hand, but then they will move on to the next crisis at hand. So I would urge ASEAN is given an opportunity to resolve this crisis, but at the same time, ASEAN is not stopping everyone else to try to resolve this issue bilaterally, or the UN Security Council or like-minded state to try to resolve this issue. We can all proceed on different tracks, but nonetheless, at the moment, the Tatmadaw is willing to engage with ASEAN, and ASEAN is willing to engage with the Tatmadaw. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Kind, your opinion and thoughts, please.
In my opinion, I think we have to use all the tools, available tools. Yeah, ASEAN is we consider ASEAN as one of the tools in our toolbox. Actually, multilateral approach is, we have to we have to take and we have to recognize it. I think because Myanmar, as Lillian and Eric said, Myanmar's coup crisis, not only coup, the previous crisis also very complex. So one single entity cannot. It's almost impossible to resolve the complex issue. That's why UN, we have to use all the available, available channels, venues, or UN Security Council, also bilateral, bilateral negotiation, bilateral mediation mechanisms. We have to use. But as Eric said, ASEAN, because Myanmar is a member country, so and the neighboring countries, so we are closer to ASEAN than US or and then the Commodore, also the military, they actually they see ASEAN less aggressive, more neutral towards them than and US and UN. But at the same time, I think that ASEAN has also big interest in in addressing this issue, because it is an anchor for anchor for the regional stability. Otherwise, so ASEAN will be very difficult to engage with others or countries. For example, US ASEAN, EU ASEAN, because definitely these countries will impose sanctions and they will not allow Myanmar to attend their meeting. They are bilateral meetings. So what will happen at that time? The legitimacy, integrity of ASEAN will be effective, and then the rivalry, the great power rivalry between China and US will also, the tensions between the US-China rivalry can also increase, and then the Myanmar can become the proxy war for these countries. Already, China has actually access and to many ethnic organizations. They have a lot of influence on them. At the same time, as you are all aware of it, and Myanmar public, so we are relying more on Western democracies. So that, and Western democracy also, they have to, they have to provide support to the public. They have to stand with the people. So that can also create a lot of instability in the region. I think that the military will always be a thorn in the side of ASEAN. So that's why I think that ASEAN stability is also at stake. That's why I think that ASEAN must be more creative and more innovative, and they have to maybe bring in other regional powers, such as China, India, Japan, Korea. They have to use, ASEAN has to also use all the available tools, all the available tools. That's my thinking. That's my understanding of the current situation. Because I agree that it's a very complex, deadlock. There's a already deadlock. Both sides, both the public and the military side, we go extreme. So the public demand is to step down. So even if possible, the people on the ground, people in rural area, people in small towns, their sons, their daughter were killed by the militaries, and they want to actually abolish the military institution completely. They want to re-establish new federal army. So one of the goals of the NUG is federal army. That's why it's very difficult for any organization to address this conflict.
Thank you, Kind. Mo, please.
It's both a boon and a bane to be the last in summing up. But I think Goh Kan Wen has put it so eloquently, and I think just bringing all the different strands of Lillian's, Eric's, and Koh Kai Win's observations together on this point. I think geopolitics, geographical proximity, and the prevailing global appetites in the world right now do not create the kind of condition that actually looks at any other regional entity at the moment, rather than ASEAN to somehow tackle this challenge. And if you look at the sweep of history of ASEAN's 50 over years of existence, I think different crises and different challenges that have popped up over the decades of ASEAN's existence and consolidation have all added to the experience of how ASEAN tries to tackle or address fresh crises or challenges that pop up. And in recent decades, it's been Myanmar that's always been pushing the envelope for ASEAN to really look at and assess how it manages what I call ASEAN's substantive centrality, with the kind of coordinating role that ASEAN's dialogue, relations, and mechanisms have to bring together a coalition of the willing, if you will, to address the situation. As I observed earlier, this crisis in Myanmar has been decades in the brewing. It did not pop up overnight. And I think in this age of instant gratification, people's attentions are on finding some kind of magic wand solution and then moving on. But I think what the reality is, long after the world's attention has moved on to the next crisis, it's ASEAN and the different member states of ASEAN, in the different countries and governments in Southeast Asia that will have to continue working with and dealing with and consulting across the board with stakeholders in Myanmar for the future and stability and security of that country and the people in that country.
Thank you, Mo. Sorry. In fact, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Kind. Thank you, Lillian. And thank you, Mo. Your answer seems to be your final remarks. It somehow turns into your final remarks that we will all take note and take lessons from that. So our thanks for that. To all of our attendees and participants, unfortunately that we are totally running out of time. We're supposed to end at 12:10 and it's already 20 past 12. So we have to cut this session short, but please bear in mind that all of your questions will be recorded. My team and I will record all these questions and will debate these questions in the future, because these questions are all equally important. And all of these questions and findings will be in our report towards the ASEAN Prosperity Index, the project that IDEAS is working on. And the online discussion that we have today is part and parcel of the API projects that IDEA is currently undertaking. Yeah, so every single thoughts, discussions, and questions matter to our project. I will definitely deliberate all of this to our stakeholders in the near future. Once again, thank you for supporting IDEAS. Thank you, panelists, for agreeing to do this. Thank you to all attendees and participants. Do follow IDEAS on our social media and our social platforms to give us some support to put this agenda forward and to make sure that all our research go to the stakeholders as well as the grassroots. We are hoping for the API index to be coming out soon. Therefore, all of your inputs are totally valuable. With that, on behalf of IDEAS, once again, thank you, everyone. I apologize for any shortcomings, any wrongdoings throughout moderating the sessions. Nevertheless, it was a really fruitful, refreshing, and engaging sessions. Congratulations to all of us, and let's do more work for the betterment of Myanmar. With that, I will happily surrender the floor to our MC, Ms. Salsabila Abdulmanan.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Zokri. So we have reached the end of our session. Thank you again to all our distinguished speakers, Mr. Eric Paulson, Ms. Lillian Fan, Ms. Mo Suzar, and also Mr. Kainwin for allocating your time. We had, again, such an insightful session with all of you. Thank you to Mr. Zokri for moderating today's webinar, and thank you to all participants for attending. We hope that you all gain the inputs that you are looking for, and we hope that you will continue to support our work in the future. We would like to ask the speakers to stay, and for all the participants, you may start to leave the meeting. Thank you again and have a great day ahead.